1. Picture Rome at the height of its glory. Streets paved in marble, temples adorned with dazzling columns, fountains spilling endless streams of water. The air itself seemed heavy with the perfume of conquest. Spices from the east, wines from Gaul, silks from the farthest reaches of empire. To the world, Rome was invincible, an eternal flame of civilization that would never die. But behind the polished surface something darker festered. For every triumphal march through the Forum, there were dungeons filled with chained men. For every radiant banquet, there were whispers of cruelty. And at the center of this brilliance and decay stood one man, Nero, not merely an emperor, but a force of contradiction. To his subjects, he could be both patron of the arts and executioner of innocence, poet and tyrant, child of Rome and destroyer of it. History remembers him not for balanced governance, but for indulgence that knew no boundary. His reign was not only gilded with spectacle, it was scarred by fear. You see, power unchecked becomes more than authority. It mutates. It bends the soul, strips away empathy, reshapes the very meaning of pleasure. Nero's Rome was not simply about politics or empire. It was about appetite, hunger for spectacle, hunger for devotion, hunger for control. And it was at his banquets, those infamous gatherings whispered about in hushed tones, that this hunger found its most grotesque expression. Imagine for a moment stepping into those feasts. The torchlight flickers against painted ceilings, shadows stretching across golden walls. Musicians play melodies sweet enough to mask the screams echoing in your mind. Servants move like ghosts, carrying trays piled high with roasted meats and fruits glistening with honey. Laughter swells like waves, forced, nervous, desperate. For here, a smile was survival, and silence was a prayer. What began as celebration blurred into punishment. What should have been nourishment became theater of cruelty. But to understand why these gatherings were more than rumors, you must first see Rome itself, not as a tourist marvel of ruins, but as a living organism pulsing with contradictions. This was an empire obsessed with power, spectacle, and legacy. Gladiatorial games soaked the sand with blood, yet were called entertainment. Public executions were dressed as moral lessons, yet were secretly delights of cruelty. In this culture, banquets were never just meals. They were stages where politics, desire, and fear played out beneath the watchful gaze of the emperor. Nero knew this better than anyone. He was not Rome's prisoner of tradition. He was its conductor. With every gathering, he orchestrated more than feasts. He orchestrated terror wrapped in extravagance. Here, the cost of wine was not measured in coin, but in dignity. Here, the applause was not for poetry, but for survival. And so the rumors spread like smoke through alleyways, of dinners where guests were forced to watch the torment of prisoners, where the line between host and predator blurred, of games staged not in the Colosseum, but in the candlelit chambers of Nero's palace. Stories of decadence became inseparable from stories of death. Were they exaggerations? Perhaps. But in an empire where history was written by survivors and silence was bought by fear, truth itself became slippery. What mattered most was the psychological shadow these rumors cast. Because you, yes, you, can imagine it, can't you? You've been at gatherings where a smile masks discomfort, where laughter hides unease. Now magnify that feeling 100-fold, and place yourself under the gaze of a ruler who decides in an instant whether you live, whether you suffer, or whether you vanish into the silence of history. That is the stage upon which Nero's banquets unfolded. But this story isn't just about Nero or even about Rome. It's about the human cost of unchecked desire. The empire was vast, yet in its heart, humanity was small, fragile, expendable. For every coin tossed to buy applause, there was a child left hungry in the slums. For every jewel-encrusted goblet lifted in a toast, there was blood spilled on the floor of an arena. For every song Nero performed in self-indulgence, there were thousands whose cries were drowned out by the music of empire. The historian Tacitus once wrote with chilling restraint, "Under Nero, Rome learned to serve." Those words conceal an abyss of fear. To serve meant more than obedience. It meant erasing your will, your dignity, even your identity. At his banquets, guests were not only fed, they were tested. Could they flatter convincingly? Could they laugh at cruelty? Could they survive the night without crossing an invisible line? The cost of failure was unthinkable, yet always present, lingering like a blade above the throat. As we step into this tale, I ask you to look beyond the spectacle. This is not a story of gluttony alone. It is not about the shine of gold or the excess of wine. It is about shadows, about how power, when left unchained, feeds upon the very humanity it claims to elevate. It is about how fear can turn feasts into funerals, and how memory itself becomes haunted by rumor, half-truth, and silence. Rome glittered, yes, but Rome also bled, and at the table of Nero, both truths sat side by side. Wine and blood poured together, impossible to distinguish. So, as you follow me deeper into the empire's most infamous nights, I ask, are you ready to see what lies beneath the marble? Are you ready to look past the silk curtains, past the music, past the forced laughter? Because once you glimpse the shadow of Nero's feasts, you cannot look away. This is not just history. It is a mirror, reflecting what happens when desire becomes tyranny and when humanity is sacrificed at the altar of appetite. The story of Nero's feasts does not begin at the golden tables of his adulthood. It begins in the shadows of his childhood, a place where innocence should have lived, but where instead manipulation, paranoia, and ambition thrived. If you wish to understand the monster Rome came to fear, you must first see the boy Rome never truly knew. Imagine him, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, born in 37 AD, long before the name Nero carried the weight of tyranny. He was a child of noble blood, yes, but also of cursed legacy. His lineage ran with ambition and betrayal, and none embodied those traits more than his mother, Agrippina the Younger. To the world, she was sister of the Emperor Caligula, later wife of Emperor Claudius, and ultimately the mother of a boy destined for the throne. But within her eyes flickered a ruthless fire. To Agrippina, motherhood was not tenderness, it was strategy. From the moment of his birth, Nero was less a son and more a pawn. Agrippina saw in him not a fragile child, but the vessel of her own power. His earliest memories were not of lullabies or playful laughter, but of watching his mother weave webs of manipulation in Rome's most dangerous courts. She whispered that survival was a game of masks, that trust was weakness, that love was an illusion. Power, she taught him, is not inherited, it is taken. And so, even before he could fully grasp language, Nero was surrounded by tension, by fear, by the ever-present scent of poison. For this was a household where a cup of wine could mean death, where a smile might conceal betrayal. In this atmosphere, affection and paranoia intertwined, shaping a boy who would never know the difference between intimacy and control. When Nero was only 3 years old, fate delivered its first cruel lesson. His uncle, the infamous Emperor Caligula, was assassinated. Chaos swept through Rome, and Agrippina, accused of conspiracy, was exiled. Nero, barely more than a toddler, was torn from the safety of privilege and plunged into uncertainty. For years he lived in obscurity, his childhood marked by instability. Imagine the impact. A boy too young to understand politics, yet old enough to feel the sting of abandonment. His earliest bond, with the very empire he would one day rule, was fractured by fear. Then came Claudius. The calculating Agrippina clawed her way back into power by seducing the aging emperor, becoming his wife and securing her son's adoption into the imperial family. Overnight, Lucius became Nero Claudius Caesar. Overnight, a forgotten boy was thrust into a world of luxury he could scarcely comprehend. Silk sheets replaced rough blankets. Perfumed baths replaced the grime of exile. But beneath the velvet surface lay another lesson. Luxury was not safety. Luxury was a weapon. Picture the young Nero wandering marble halls lined with gilded statues, every step echoing with both wonder and dread. Servants bowed low, but their eyes betrayed contempt. Courtiers smiled, but whispered venom once he passed. Even in privilege, Nero was an outsider, forced to navigate a world where kindness was theater and loyalty was bought. For a boy already molded by fear, these experiences planted seeds of something darker, a hunger for control, a craving for admiration, and a gnawing insecurity that would never leave him. Historians tell us that Agrippina micromanaged his upbringing. She chose his tutors, ensuring he learned not only philosophy and music, but also the art of survival. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, tasked with guiding him, sought to temper the boy's impulses with reason. Yet no philosophy could erase the lessons burned into Nero's childhood, that survival required performance, and that cruelty often won where kindness failed. Every day was a rehearsal for a role he had not yet been then, and every act of affection from his mother came bound in chains of expectation. You must picture it, this boy standing before Rome's elite, reciting poetry, plucking strings, acting in performances. Outwardly he was praised, applauded, celebrated, but within a seed of bitterness grew. Was it him they admired, or the power he represented? Did they cheer for the boy, or bow to the shadow of Agrippina? These questions dug into him like splinters, and in time they would fester into something monstrous. There is an old truth. Children raised in cages often learn to wield cages themselves. Nero's cage was built not of iron, but of manipulation and ambition. To mask his insecurity, he performed. To silence his doubts, he sought control. And when performance and control were not enough, cruelty offered the illusion of certainty. It is no coincidence that his later banquets became spectacles of power disguised as art, indulgence twisted into dominance. He was, after all, repeating the only lessons he had ever truly known. Agrippina's ambitions taught him that people were tools. His exile taught him that safety was fleeting. Claudius's court taught him that love was theater. Together, these lessons shaped a boy who could no longer distinguish intimacy from possession, admiration from fear. Consider this. At 13, Nero was married to Claudius's daughter Octavia, further entrenching him in dynastic politics. By 17, through Agrippina's ruthless maneuvering and Claudius's suspicious death, some whispered by poison, Nero stood as emperor of Rome. 17, an age when most are barely men, when the heart still trembles with youth. Yet here was Nero, a boy turned ruler, cloaked in power but haunted by insecurity. Imagine standing in his shoes, thrust before an empire expecting greatness, while knowing deep down that your every achievement was built not on your own merit, but on the suffocating grip of your mother. How could such a beginning not warp the soul? How could a childhood carved from manipulation and paranoia produce anything but obsession? The grotesque appetites that would later define Nero's reign, the feasts, the cruelty, the hunger for adoration, were not sudden indulgences. They were the fruit of roots planted long before. And so, when you hear of Nero's banquets, do not think only of an emperor gone mad. Think of the boy who never knew love without strings, who never knew safety without fear, who never knew admiration without suspicion. Think of the lessons whispered into his ears by a mother who saw him not as flesh and blood, but as a crown to be worn. Because here lies the haunting truth. Nero was not born a monster. He was made by a childhood where innocence was poisoned, where ambition replaced affection, and where cruelty became the language of survival. And as he stepped into his reign, carrying within him all the scars of those years, Rome itself would soon bear the cost. So ask yourself, if power is taught before compassion, if fear replaces love, what kind of man emerges? What kind of emperor rises? And most chilling of all, what kind of horrors does he unleash upon the world? The banquet table was never just a place to eat, not in Rome, not under Nero. Food was sustenance, yes, but in the hands of emperors it became something else. A display of wealth, a performance of power, a theater where every dish told a story. For Nero, whose obsession with performance already defined his youth, the feast became his stage. Yet unlike poetry or music, this theater was not harmless. It was the kind of stage where others bled for the applause. At first it seemed like a game, entertainment designed to delight and amuse. Guests reclined on couches draped in silks, their goblets refilled endlessly with Falernian wine, the richest vintage in the empire. Musicians strummed delicate melodies, while the air was perfumed with incense so thick it clung to the skin. But if you had been there, if you had felt the weight of Nero's gaze, you would have known the truth. The laughter around the table was strained. The jokes were cruel, and beneath the glitter of silver platters lay something rotten. It began with humiliation. Slaves, the silent backbone of Roman luxury, became pawns in their master's amusement. Some were forced to serve dishes in absurd costumes, dressed as animals, mocked for stumbles that were punished with lashes. Others were made to perform grotesque parodies, their trembling voices ridiculed by noble guests who dared not resist the spectacle. Imagine being one of them, your life already owned, your dignity stripped further, not by necessity, but by the whim of an emperor craving laughter. Nero's fascination with theater turned dinner into cruelty disguised as performance. He delighted in improvising scenes of humiliation. Enemies of Rome, or simply rivals who had fallen from favor, were paraded before guests. They were made to serve at the table, their noble lineage mocked, their downfall displayed like an exotic dish. The cruelty was deliberate, to Rema. In every guest that power was fragile, that fortune could reverse in an instant, that at Nero's table you might dine like royalty today and serve as entertainment tomorrow. Psychologists today might call it projection, an insecure man masking his own fears by inflicting humiliation on others. But in Nero's Rome there was no vocabulary for this, only the sickening laughter of courtiers desperate to prove their loyalty. To laugh was survival, to look away was suspicion, to protest was unthinkable. And so the room echoed with forced mirth, even as fear curled like smoke beneath it. But the theater of cruelty never stays small. Humiliation soon escalated. What began as parody bled into torment. A servant might be forced to endure scalding food pressed against his skin while guests cheered. A rival might be ordered to crawl on hands and knees, imitating an animal for the emperor's amusement. The line between dinner and punishment blurred until one could no longer tell where feast ended and spectacle began. You, sitting there, might have thought, this is not entertainment, it is a warning. And you would have been right, because Nero's banquets were never truly about food or laughter. They were about control. Every act of cruelty was a message whispered between bites. I hold your fate in my hand. The historian Suetonius records that Nero's love of jokes grew darker with time, shifting from harmless pranks to deadly games. At his banquets, he was said to release wild animals into the dining hall, delighting in the chaos as terrified guests scrambled for safety. Other accounts suggest he ordered prisoners brought in, their punishment woven into the evening's entertainment. Imagine sipping wine while someone at the far end of the room was beaten, mocked, perhaps even killed, all while music played on as if nothing were amiss. For Nero, cruelty was not only spectacle, it was art. He framed suffering as performance, turning human pain into theater, and in doing so, he foreshadowed horrors yet to come. These early entertainments were, the deeper we enter Nero's feasts, the clearer it becomes. These were not meals. They were trials, stages where power was tasted not in wine, but in fear. What began as petty humiliations soon grew into spectacles of domination, banquets where the very act of eating became submission, where the line between host and jailer blurred, and where survival was measured not by appetite, but by obedience. Guests arrived to find tables bending under the weight of abundance. Platters gleamed with roasted peacocks, their feathers dyed with gold dust, eels coiled on beds of saffron rice. Entire boars were stuffed with smaller animals, a grotesque nesting of flesh designed to overwhelm. Honey dripped from figs so heavy they split open in the hand. To look upon the feast was to be dazzled, until you realized the danger hidden beneath. Because this was no ordinary indulgence, you could not simply taste or decline or moderate yourself. You had to eat. To refuse was insult, and insult under Nero was peril. He demanded excess, demanded that mouths keep moving, demanded that cups remain full, and so the guests, bloated and weary, forced themselves to consume beyond their limits. The act of eating, which should have been pleasure, became torment. Each bite was obedience, each swallow was survival. Can you picture it? Reclining on a couch, your stomach twisting, your throat raw from wine, yet still you must lift your cup. Still you must chew, swallow, and smile, as though this grotesque consumption were a gift. Around you, courtiers force laughter between gasps for air, their faces flushed, their hands trembling. The room smells of meat, of spices, of too much sweetness, cloying and suffocating. You feel yourself drowning not in water, but in indulgence. Some accounts tell us of a night when Nero commanded entire dining halls to be perfumed with roses. At first, it must have seemed enchanted. In a rain of petals drifting from the ceiling, the air filled with fragrance. But as the night wore on, the perfume thickened, clinging to skin, filling lungs. The petals piled high, smothering, suffocating. What began as beauty became horror. The guests, trapped beneath the emperor's gift, struggled to breathe. Some whispered that people died that night, not by blade or fire, but by the slow, crushing weight of roses. Such was Nero's genius for cruelty, to disguise torment as generosity, to make death appear as luxury. Every sense was assaulted, sight overwhelmed by gold and silk, taste numbed by excess, smell suffocated by perfume. Guests left not nourished, but drained, their bodies and minds bent under the weight of indulgence they dared not refuse. But Nero's banquets went further still. He was a man obsessed with performance, and his feasts became stages for grotesque dramas. Prisoners, captured enemies, or even disgraced nobles were forced to act in scenes designed by the emperor. They were dressed in costumes, paraded before guests, their suffering transformed into spectacle. Some played mythological figures, reenacting tragedies where their deaths were not symbolic, but real. Imagine watching a man bound as Icarus, forced to fall from a contrived stage, his body breaking as the crowd was told to applaud. Imagine a woman dressed as a goddess, humiliated, tormented, her cries drowned beneath music and laughter. These were not stories told on parchment. They were lived in flesh and blood, witnessed by Rome's elite, who smiled through their terror, knowing the same fate could be theirs. To sit at Nero's table was to sit in a theater of cruelty where the script was always written by one man, and where any role could be yours without warning. And here lies the deeper horror. The banquets were not only physical trials, they were psychological weapons. Nero understood. Odd that fear was most effective when dressed as celebration. To outward eyes, these gatherings were lavish, filled with wine, music, laughter, but to those within, they were prisons disguised as paradise. Submission was demanded not by chains, but by smiles. Compliance was measured not by silence, but by applause. Every guest was both actor and audience, trapped in a play where the price of failing your role was unthinkable. You must see the genius of this cruelty. To command obedience by force breeds resistance, but to command obedience by spectacle, by indulgence, by fear woven into beauty, that breeds silence, that breeds complicity. Guests left those halls sickened, horrified, yet bound tighter to Nero because they had played their part, laughed at his cruelty, eaten from his hand, and in doing so, they became participants in their own submission. Consider how this shaped Rome itself. An empire that once prided itself on discipline, on stoic strength, now found its leaders reclining in halls where roses smothered lungs and cruelty was clapped as art. The culture shifted. Fear was no longer found only in prisons or arenas. It was in dining rooms, in golden halls, in the very act of raising a cup to one's lips. And perhaps you, listening now, ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have eaten beyond your breaking point? Would you have laughed as a prisoner cried for mercy? Would you have applauded, knowing that hesitation could cost you everything? These are not easy questions, but they are the questions Nero's banquets force upon us. They remind us that tyranny is not sustained by the tyrant alone. It is sustained by those who, out of fear, play along. And the deeper the play becomes, the harder it is to step outside of it. This is why the banquets mattered. They were not frivolous indulgences. They were tools of control. Every dish, every performance, every suffocating breath of roses was a reminder. Nero owned not only your body, but your will. You did not simply eat at his table, you surrendered at it. And as we look ahead, we must ask, if this is what excess could do, if roses could smother, if gluttony could enslave, if theater could humiliate, what happens when desire turns darker still? What happens when food and laughter are no longer enough to satisfy an emperor's hunger? Because Nero's feasts were only beginning. The roses had fallen, the goblets had been drained, but the shadow of what was to come still lingered in the air, a shadow that would stretch beyond gluttony, beyond humiliation, into something far more grotesque. By now, the tables of Nero's banquets had become theaters of mastery, mastery over food, over fear, over obedience. Yet even these grotesque displays of gluttony and humiliation were not enough. The emperor's appetite had another dimension, darker, more insidious, the hunger for control entwined with desire. In these rooms of gold and shadow, intimacy itself became a weapon, and lust was measured in the currency of terror. Imagine sitting there, reclining on a couch, your senses assaulted by the scent of spiced meats, the cloying perfume of roses, the soft echo of music that masks screams. At first, the scene might seem seductive. Noble women draped in silks, noble men polished and poised, their faces painted with smiles. But you quickly realize that every glance, every touch, every movement has been orchestrated by Nero's imagination, twisted into performance. You are not a guest, you are part of the play, whether you wish it or not. Nero's genius lay in the subtlety of terror. He blurred lines between intimacy and cruelty until they became indistinguishable. A guest might find themselves invited to share a private toast with the emperor, only to discover that the same gesture would be followed by humiliation. Punishments became sexualized, a grotesque melding of desire and shame. Women, men, none were spared. They were stripped of identity, reduced to bodies, to performers in a game they had no script for, their only choice obedience. Consider the accounts left by historians like Suetonius and Tacitus. They describe banquets where guests were forced to witness erotic punishments. Acts that were supposed to be private, sacred even, were staged as public spectacles. Victims were paraded, their cries drowned by laughter or music, their dignity erased by the gleam of gold and the weight of silk. What was supposed to be pleasure became performance, what was supposed to be desire became fear. Imagine, if you can, a young woman brought forward, trembling beneath the gaze of the emperor. She wears a costume, perhaps that of a goddess, her body exposed beneath the soft light of lamps. Around her the guests clap, laugh, but it is not admiration. They are witnesses, complicit through terror. To look away is suspicion. To protest is unthinkable. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every forced smile is a negotiation with survival. In this room, innocence is currency, and fear is payment. Nero did not merely orchestrate physical acts, he choreographed the psyche. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that power is amplified when fear is entwined with desire. A whispered promise, a brush of silk, the faint scent of perfume, all became instruments of control. The mind becomes pliable when pleasure is tethered to terror. And so even those who thought themselves untouchable, noblemen, courtiers, advisors, learned to bend, to smile, to play their role in a twisted ballet where failure meant devastation. This was not decadence alone, it was psychological warfare. Objectification was weaponized. Guests became both audience and victim, observers of acts they could neither condemn nor emulate without risk. The very act of witnessing was participation. Every laugh, every nod, every token of approval was a surrender of autonomy. And in this surrender, Nero found his ultimate triumph, the transformation of fear into fascination, of cruelty into spectacle. And yet, there is a subtle horror in the quiet moments. Behind the perfumed walls, whispered secrets spread like wildfire. Women spoke in trembling tones about the whispered suggestions, the impossible demands, the private arrangements orchestrated by the emperor. Men confided in hushed voices about acts that defied reason and morality. Desire, once natural and human, had been perverted into a tool of domination. Leisure became inseparable from the threat of violence, and intimacy became a test of obedience. Perhaps you wonder what it felt like to witness this, the tension of beauty and terror intertwined, the impossibility of distinguishing consent from coercion. It is a place where morality bends under the weight of spectacle, where what is forbidden is made visible for amusement, and where survival demands participation in acts that scar the soul. To be present is to be marked, whether physically or in memory, by the emperor's gaze. But here lies the cruelest twist. The participants, once released from the hall, carried the memory with them. They returned to their homes, whispered stories to their families, yet could never fully speak the truth. The emperor's shadow lingered, and fear continued to weave its invisible chains. Desire, once personal, had been transformed into public submission. In every interaction, the echo of that night haunted them, the knowledge that power could reach into intimacy and twist it into terror. You may ask yourself, how does a society allow this? How does an empire, so proud and powerful, permit its ruler to transform human bodies into instruments of spectacle and fear? Perhaps it is because tyranny is most effective not when it rules by force alone, but when it rules through complicity. People learn to obey not only out of fear for their lives, but out of fear for their dignity, their identity, their capacity to endure shame. And yet there is another dimension here, a human fascination with the forbidden. Nero's feasts demonstrate the dangerous intersection of curiosity and terror. We watch now, centuries later, compelled and horrified, because the emperor understood the primal intrigue of boundaries being crossed, of norms being shattered. He weaponized instinct, fascination, and desire, turning them into instruments of domination. Every act, every whispered suggestion, every staged humiliation was a message. Power and pleasure are inseparable when wielded by those who understand fear. The implications stretch far beyond the walls of the palace. Desire intertwined with cruelty transforms communities, erodes empathy, and reshapes morality. In Nero's Rome, it created a hierarchy where submission was rewarded with survival, and resistance was met with spectacle, punishment, or death. What is consent when fear is ever present? What is intimacy when it can be corrupted by the whim of a tyrant? These are the questions that linger long after the candles are extinguished and the guests have fled. As we leave this chapter of Nero's reign, you must carry with you a haunting reflection. The line between fascination and fear is fragile, and those who wield power without restraint can manipulate both with devastating precision. Nero's feasts were no longer mere indulgence. They were laboratories of control, arenas where desire was weaponized, where humanity was fragmented, and where survival demanded submission to cruelty, masquerading as pleasure. And so we step forward into the next stage of his reign, aware that what begins as subtle manipulation escalates, that the blending of desire and terror sets the stage for horrors beyond imagination. The banquets were no longer simply feasts, they were preludes. Preludes to rituals that would stain Rome's history with blood, spectacle, and the twisted interplay of pleasure and pain. What comes next is darker still, for in Nero's world there are no boundaries, only the ever-expanding reach of power, fear, and forbidden desire. And as we venture into those nights, one question remains. When appetite and cruelty merge completely, what becomes of the human soul? By the time Nero's banquets reached their apex, they were no longer merely displays of excess or cruelty, they had become theaters of death. The same rooms that once dazzled with gilded platters and perfumed air now bore witness to horrors that transformed spectators into participants and guests into actors in the emperor's grotesque dramas. Here, power was measured not only by wealth or influence, but by the ability to stage suffering, and survival demanded silence. Imagine reclining in the velvet shadows of a dining hall where the air smells of roasted meats, incense, and coppery blood. Around you, the chatter of nobles is nervous, punctuated by forced laughter. Torches flicker along walls lined with golden panels, reflecting the glint of silver and the horror of what is to come. For tonight, the feast is no longer just about indulgence, it is about spectacle, and the stakes are life and death. Executions, once public spectacles confined to the arena, are now woven seamlessly into the banquet itself. Tacitus records with chilling clarity that prisoners were brought directly into the hall, their limbs shackled, their faces pale with fear. They were placed as living props, displayed amidst the lavish abundance, their fates suspended in a cruel limbo. The emperor's guests watched, their expressions betraying horror even as their tongues praised the emperor, a survival instinct honed through repeated exposure to terror. It begins subtly, almost imperceptibly. A nobleman accused of conspiracy is brought forward, hands bound, robes torn. Nero raises a goblet, perhaps in jest, and the victim is struck, laughed at, forced to perform before the assembly. A gladiator may be introduced, not in the arena, but mid-feast, forced into a duel where failure means instant death. The clash of steel is drowned by music and chatter, and applause becomes a shield, a signal that the audience obeys, that their terror is contained beneath the veneer of civility. The theater of death is not chaos, it is meticulously choreographed. Nero understands that horror achieves its full effect only when fear is coupled with spectacle. Imagine the tension as each act unfolds. A whispered command, the flash of a blade, the restrained scream of the condemned. Guests cling to the illusion of control, telling themselves it is merely performance, that their seat at the table is safe. But the truth is unyielding. In Nero's world, no one is exempt, no one untouchable. Consider the psychological weight of such feasts. To dine while another dies is to confront mortality in its rawest form. Yet the guests, trained by repetition and intimidation, mask terror with laughter and applause. Tacitus describes how nobles were forced to clap as men were strangled or dismembered, their own hands trembling even as their faces betrayed no weakness. Every clap, every cheer is a small surrender, an acknowledgement of Nero's supremacy. Every guest learns, subtly, that their dignity is secondary to survival. The emperor's brilliance in cruelty lies in its duality, horror framed as celebration. The contrast is striking. On the one hand, there is gold, wine, and music. On the other, blood, suffering, and screams. It is a spectacle designed to imprint fear into memory while entertaining the privileged. Imagine tasting honeyed figs as a man is dragged across the floor, his life extinguished for the amusement of those who must pretend indifference. Every bite, every sip, every gesture becomes a negotiation with morality and instinct. Some nights, entire tables were turned into stages for gladiatorial combat. Armed men, prisoners, and slaves were forced to duel while the elite reclined nearby, their applause coerced, their silence dangerous. Survival in these moments was not heroism, but compliance. To hesitate, to flinch, or to refuse was an invitation to join the victims. Each duel, each death, reinforced the theater's ultimate lesson. That power, when absolute, redefines morality, and that pleasure and terror are inexorably entwined. The trauma endured by guests and observers was profound, though often veiled in official propaganda. Nero's historians, commissioned or coerced, sought to portray him as magnanimous or cultured. Tacitus and Suetonius, however, left subtle traces of the fear etched into memory. The whispers, the trembling courtiers, the noblewomen who would faint at the sight of blood yet remain at the table, knowing flight was impossible. These accounts, fragmentary though they are, allow us to glimpse the psychological landscape of Rome under Nero, one where power, spectacle, and terror converged to create a culture of silent complicity. You, imagining yourself in that hall, might struggle to comprehend the strain of compliance. Every laugh is a lie, every toast a mask, every cheer a prayer for survival. And in this hall, intimacy, friendship, and even loyalty are transactional, measured by how convincingly you can feign approval. The human cost is invisible but pervasive. The mind fractures under repeated exposure to cruelty. Memory becomes haunted by sight and sound, and the very act of living in such proximity to power transforms perception itself. Yet, Nero's theater did not merely terrorize, it trained. It normalized cruelty, taught submission, and blurred the line between entertainment and atrocity. Guests returned to their homes, carrying a secret. They had applauded death, and by doing so they had become part of the emperor's performance. Every feast, every staged execution reinforced the hierarchy, the omnipotence of the emperor, and the fragility of those who dared to sit at his table. And this normalization of horror was intentional. Nero understood that fear, when coupled with luxury and spectacle, becomes seductive. It binds people, not through chains, but through awe and dependence. He transformed the act of watching death into a ritual of obedience, a grotesque ceremony that reinforced his control over body, mind, and memory. The dining hall, once a place of pleasure, had become a laboratory for the manipulation of the human psyche. The implications stretch beyond the walls of the palace. Rome itself, steeped in culture and civility, was infiltrated by this atmosphere of staged terror. Senators, magistrates, and noble families carried tales of banquets where death was entertainment, returning to their domains with both fear and fascination. This is how a ruler shapes not only behavior, but morality. By redefining what is permissible, by entwining power with terror, and by making spectators complicit in acts they cannot condone. And as we step back from the flickering torches, the sound of forced laughter, the metallic tang of fear, one question emerges. How does an empire endure when its rulers transform feasts into theaters of death? How does memory persist when trauma is veiled by opulence and terror is masked by applause? For the guests of Nero's table, survival was not victory, it was silence, compliance, and the constant shadow of what might come next. And yet, through these nights of horror, through these orchestrated deaths and forced performances, the emperor's power became absolute, and his legacy indelibly etched into the psyche of Rome. As we prepare to explore the final stages of Nero's reign, remember this. The theater of death was not a deviation. It was the logical progression of his appetite for control, spectacle, and domination. The banquets were both lesson and warning, and their echoes resonate through history, leaving a haunting question for us all. When pleasure, fear, and power converge completely, what becomes of humanity?